Before my son walked down the aisle, I drove to a small dry cleaning shop on the edge of town to pick up my dress shirt. The owner, a man named Frank DeLuca, had pressed my clothes for 32 years. The moment I pushed open his glass door, he looked up from the counter and went completely still. He walked around the register, grabbed my arm without saying a single word, and steered me behind the back curtain into a narrow storage room that smelled of steam and chemical solvent. He pressed one finger to his lips, pointed at the thin wall separating us from the front of the shop, and mouthed the words, "Stay quiet." I thought Frank had finally lost his mind. Then I heard the voice on the other side of that wall, and the world I had spent 64 years building quietly collapsed beneath my feet. My name is Walter Caine. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years as a maritime insurance investigator, which means I spent my entire career finding the truth that people tried to drown. I know how fraud is constructed. I know how a lie is maintained. I know the specific smell of a story that has been rehearsed too many times. But God help me, I did not see it coming from inside my own family. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from today. And stay with me, because what I heard through that wall changed every single thing. It was a Thursday morning, 5 days before my son Daniel's wedding. Daniel was 31 years old, a high school history teacher with a laugh so big it filled up whatever room he was standing in. His mother, my wife Carol, passed away from cancer 4 years ago, and since then it had been just the two of us. I was paying for the entire wedding, a waterfront venue in Savannah, Georgia, 220 guests, the whole production, because Daniel deserved every bit of it. He was engaged to a woman named Sasha Merritt, 29, beautiful, sharp-tongued in a way that always made me slightly uneasy. She had arrived in Daniel's life 18 months earlier, introduced by a mutual friend, and within 6 weeks, she had moved into his apartment. Her older brother, a man named Colin, had flown in from Seattle 2 weeks before the wedding to help with final arrangements. He was polished, well-dressed, and just a little too comfortable for a man I had only met twice. That Thursday morning, I walked into Frank's shop expecting to pick up a shirt. I was not prepared for what came next. Through the thin partition wall, I heard Sasha's voice first. She was not using the warm, slightly performative tone she always used around Daniel. Her voice was flat, businesslike, and completely cold. She told Colin that the timeline was tight but manageable. She said the waterfront suite had already been reserved under a different name. She told him the pills were in the overnight bag and that 3 days was more than enough time. Colin responded in a low murmur, something I could not fully catch. Then Sasha said the words that turned my blood to standing ice water. "He won't even know it was the pills. By the time anyone checks, we'll already be gone. The account transfers automatically on day 4. I stood in that storage room with steam irons pressing against my back and I did not breathe. I let my training do what it had done for 38 years. I listened. I cataloged. I did not move. They were in the shop for another 4 minutes. I heard the rustle of garment bags, a brief exchange about pickup times, and then the brass bell above Frank's front door chimed, and they were gone. Frank opened the curtain. He was gripping the doorframe with both hands, his knuckles pale. He told me he had heard them planning something once before, in a brief phone call Sasha made outside his shop window 3 weeks ago. He had not understood it fully then, but today he had understood every word, and he knew he was listening to something dangerous. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I shook his hand, thanked him quietly, and walked out to my truck. I sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on my dashboard without blinking. The part of my brain that processed emotion had shut completely down, and the part of my brain that processed evidence had come fully online. I had heard enough to know 3 things. Daniel was the target. The mechanism involved pills and a bank account, and I had 5 days. I did not call the police. I had no recording. I had the testimony of an elderly dry cleaner and my own recollection of a muffled conversation heard through drywall. Any halfway competent attorney would bury it in 20 minutes. I drove directly to Daniel's apartment. That confrontation was the first catastrophic mistake I made, and I made it because I am his father and I was terrified. I walked in, sat across from Daniel at his kitchen table, and told him exactly what I had heard. I told him about Frank, about the storage room, about the pills and the account transfers in Sasha's flat, cold voice. Daniel listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me, very gently, that I had not been myself since his mother died. He said I had been looking for reasons to distrust Sasha since the day he introduced her. He said this sounded like something I had convinced myself I heard, not something that actually happened. He was not angry. He was patient and sad, which was somehow worse than anger. Sasha walked in from the bedroom. She had clearly heard every word. She looked at me with an expression I recognized immediately from my career, the look of someone who is completely confident they will not be found out. She sat down beside Daniel, placed her hand over his, and calmly suggested that perhaps the stress of planning a large wedding while still grieving Carol had taken a greater toll on me than any of us had realized. She suggested I speak to someone. She said it with a kindness so practiced it was almost beautiful. I looked at Daniel's face and saw that he believed her entirely. I stood up, told him I loved him, and walked out. I sat in my truck in the parking garage beneath his building for 40 minutes. I was not processing grief. I was drafting a plan, because I had spent 38 years investigating fraud, and I knew exactly what Sasha had just done. She had taken my evidence and converted it into my liability. If I pushed harder, I became the unstable, grieving father. If I backed off, Daniel was exposed. The only viable path was to gather proof so solid, so layered and irrefutable, that there was no counter-narrative available to her. I needed help, not a standard private investigator. I needed someone who understood financial fraud the way a surgeon understands tissue at the cellular level. I called a woman named Renata Sousa. Renata was a former federal financial crimes analyst I had worked alongside 15 years ago on a large marine insurance case involving fabricated vessel losses. She had been pushed out of the agency for refusing to close a case her supervisors wanted buried. She had been doing private forensic financial work ever since. When I explained what I needed, she did not ask about payment. She said she would be at my hotel by 8 the next morning, and she was. We needed to move carefully. The first thing I did was call Daniel and apologize. I let my voice carry the exact weight of a man who had finally accepted that he was wrong. I told him I was embarrassed, that the stress had gotten the better of me, and that I was committed to being fully present for his wedding. I could hear the relief in his voice. He put Sasha on the line. I apologized to her directly. She accepted with gracious warmth, and I heard the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed the threat had been neutralized. I hung up and looked at Renata. She was already typing. The wedding invitations listed Sasha's family address as a home in Bellevue, Washington, a prosperous suburb east of Seattle known for large houses and old tech money. Colin had dropped references to their family's commercial property holdings throughout every dinner conversation he had joined. He name-dropped a private members club, a family boat, a beach house on the Olympic Peninsula. He wore a watch I recognized as a genuine piece, which was the detail that made me most careful. Most fraudsters get the big things right and miss the small ones. Colin had the watch, the vocabulary, and the manners. What he did not have, as Renata confirmed within 36 hours, was any documented ownership of a single square foot of property in the state of Washington. The Bellevue address listed on the invitation belonged to a commercial mail forwarding service operating out of a strip mall near a Costco. There was no residential property associated with either the Merritt name or the address. The family's supposed real estate holdings traced through a series of nested LLCs that each terminated in a registered agent address in Delaware standard shells, with minimum state fees paid from a single routing account. Renata traced the routing account. The funds originated from a series of wire transfers, each just below the federal reporting threshold, drawn from accounts in 3 different names across 2 states. One of those names was a man with a prior conviction in the state of Nevada wire fraud, targeting elderly widows through real estate investment schemes. He had served 22 months and been released. The name on the Nevada conviction was not Colin Merritt. His real name was Douglas Farr. I sat with that for a long moment in the rental car we were using, parked outside a coffee shop in Midtown Savannah. Renata turned her laptop to face me and let me read the conviction record. I read it twice. Then I asked her who Sasha was. She was quiet for a moment. She pulled up a second document. It was a marriage certificate filed in Clark County, Nevada, 7 years ago. The names on the certificate were Douglas Farr and Michelle Farr, née Collier. The woman in the photograph attached to the associated records had darker hair than Sasha wore it now, but the angle of the jaw and the set of the eyes were unmistakable. Sasha was not Colin's sister. She was his wife. I have spent a career delivering bad news to people who were not prepared for it. I have sat across from ship owners and informed them their vessel was a total loss. I have told underwriters that the claim they approved had been fraudulent from the start. I thought I knew what shock felt like from a professional distance. Sitting in that rental car, understanding that the woman my son was 5 days from marrying had been sleeping in his apartment while her husband posed as her brother and attended their engagement dinners and toasted to their future, I understood that I had never actually known what shock felt like until that moment. Renata gave me 2 minutes. Then she said we needed to keep moving. We needed to know what the mechanism was. Sasha had said the account transfers automatically on day 4. Day 4 from what? From the wedding? From a document signing? We needed to find the legal instrument. I called Richard Yates, my estate attorney of 26 years. I told him it was a matter of Daniel's life, and I needed him to review a document immediately. The document in question was a joint asset protection agreement that Sasha's attorney had circulated 3 weeks earlier, presented as a standard premarital financial planning instrument. I had skimmed it at the time. Richard had not reviewed it. I drove to Richard's office in downtown Savannah at 11 at night. He was waiting for me. He read it in 40 minutes, in silence, with his reading glasses pushed up to his forehead and his jaw locked in the expression of a man who has found something he cannot believe he is looking at. When he set it down, he took off his glasses and turned them over in his hands twice before he spoke. He told me the document was not a joint asset protection agreement. It was an irrevocable beneficiary assignment instrument, layered inside standard premarital boilerplate with enough generic language to disguise its core function on a casual read. Embedded on page 7, in a subordinate clause referencing Daniel's existing life insurance policy and investment accounts, was a provision stating that upon execution of the marriage certificate, all named beneficiaries would automatically convert to a single irrevocable designee. The name was a trust entity, not a person, and that the designee could liquidate the accounts without the account holder's consent under a medical incapacity provision. The medical incapacity provision could be triggered by a single physician's certification of mental or physical incompetence. Richard set the document flat on his desk. He told me that if Daniel signed this agreement and was then somehow rendered medically incapacitated even briefly, even with a diagnosis as vague as acute confusion or sudden cardiac event, every account Daniel owned would be legally accessible to Sasha and her trust entity within 72 hours of the certification. I thought about the pills Sasha had mentioned through the wall. I thought about 3 days is more than enough time. I thought about the waterfront suite reserved under a different name. I thanked Richard. I told him to hold the document as evidence and to say nothing to anyone. He nodded. He looked like a man who had just watched something very ugly walk through his door, and he had. I drove back to the hotel. Renata was still working. She had found a third name connected to Douglas Farr's known associates, a woman who had died 2 years ago in a boating accident off the coast of North Carolina. Newly married, 34 years old, sole heir to her father's commercial trucking business. The coroner had ruled it accidental drowning. The husband, traveling under a name Renata cross-referenced to one of Douglas Farr's prior aliases, had collected a life insurance payout of $4 million and disappeared before the estate litigation was resolved. He had done this before. I did not overturn a table. I did not scream. I am 64 years old and I have been in too many rooms where the only power I had was the power of not reacting. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and I breathed through it. And when I was done breathing through it, I picked up my phone and called the one person I had been waiting to call. His name was Agent Dennis Carver. He was a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and 12 years ago I had handed him the single largest maritime fraud case of his career on a platter. 47 months of my own investigative work, organized into binders he could take directly to a federal grand jury. He had told me at the time that if I ever needed anything within his power to provide, I should call. I had never called. Until that night. I told him everything. I gave him Renata's documentation, the Nevada conviction record, the marriage certificate, the asset protection agreement Richard had flagged, and the North Carolina death. I told him about Frank DeLuca and what I had heard through the wall of the dry cleaning shop. I told him about the pills. Dennis was quiet for a long time when I finished. Then he said he needed 48 hours to build federal jurisdiction, and that I needed to do exactly one thing in the meantime. I needed to find those pills. This was the part of the plan that carried the most risk, and I am not going to tell you it felt anything other than terrifying. Sasha and Colin Douglas were staying in a rented house 10 minutes from the venue. Renata had the address. She had also pulled the rental agreement, which listed the key code for the front door lockbox. I want to be very clear about something, because I know what you are thinking. I am not a young man. I am not a former soldier or a trained operative. I am a 64-year-old maritime fraud investigator with a bad left knee and a dress shirt I still needed to pick up from Frank's shop. But I am also a father, and there is no calculation in the world that produces an outcome where I sit in a hotel room while my son is in danger. I drove to the house at 2 in the morning. I entered through the front door using the code from the rental agreement. The house was dark and quiet. Douglas's rental car was gone. Renata had tracked his phone's public location data and confirmed he was at a late bar 2 miles away. I moved through the house with my phone flashlight angled low. In the master bedroom, on the closet shelf behind a folded duffel bag, I found a small amber pill bottle with no pharmacy label, a strip of white tape across the front, handwritten, "D. Evening." The capsules inside were blue and unmarked. I took 2, sealed them in a plastic evidence bag I had brought, and replaced the bottle exactly as I had found it. I was back in my rental car in 11 minutes. The next morning, Renata drove the capsules to a private toxicology lab she had used on previous cases. The results came back in 6 hours. The primary compound was a fast-acting benzodiazepine at 4 times the standard clinical dose, enough to cause acute disorientation, suppressed cardiac function, and in a person with no tolerance, a medical crisis indistinguishable from a spontaneous cardiac event. The secondary compound was a drug used to lower blood pressure to dangerous levels in patients with hypertension. Daniel had no hypertension. In a healthy adult male, the combination would cause a catastrophic cardiovascular collapse within 40 to 90 minutes of ingestion. It would look exactly like a sudden heart attack in a young man under wedding stress. Dennis called me that afternoon. Federal jurisdiction was established. The North Carolina case had been flagged and reopened. Agents were already in Savannah. The plan was the rehearsal dinner that evening. He explained the parameters clearly. They needed Douglas to sign the asset protection agreement under his false identity. That was the federal wire fraud trigger signing a legal instrument intended to facilitate financial extortion using a fraudulent identity. The moment that pen left the paper, they had him. But the operation required me to walk into that room and behave like a man who had completely surrendered. If I faltered for even a moment, if Sasha or Douglas sensed that anything had changed, they would not sign, and the federal case would collapse. I drove back to my hotel. I showered, pressed my shirt myself with the in-room iron, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. I had buried my wife 4 years ago. I had watched my son stand at her grave and hold himself together for my sake when I could see clearly that he was breaking. I had promised Carol, in the last conversation we ever had, that I would not let anything happen to him. I straightened my tie and walked out. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private room in the waterfront venue, 60 guests, long tables draped in white linen, candles, a string quartet in the corner playing softly. I arrived carrying a slight limp I had been developing all week, leaning on a thick wooden walking stick I had bought at an antique market on River Street. It was not for theater alone. My left knee genuinely required it after a cold week on concrete floors, but it served a purpose beyond support. People with walking sticks are dismissed. People with walking sticks are elderly and manageable and no longer a threat. Douglas greeted me at the door with the warmth of a man who believed he had already won. He shook my hand with both of his and told me the evening was going to be wonderful. I thanked him and told him Daniel was lucky to have such a supportive family around him. I watched the flicker of satisfaction cross his face, and I filed it away. Sasha was at Daniel's side near the bar. She looked radiant, genuinely, and I understood for the first time how she had done it. She was not performing warmth. She had learned to actually feel it in the moment, to generate it on demand, because that was what made her effective. That was what made her dangerous. Daniel looked happy. I spent the first hour of that dinner being completely invisible. I spoke only when spoken to. I laughed at the right moments. I let Douglas command the room with his fabricated family stories, watching him the way I used to watch claimants during depositions, cataloging the tiny inconsistencies, the slight overcorrections, the moments where the rehearsed version of himself slipped a fraction of an inch. Just before the final course was cleared, Douglas stood and tapped his glass. He announced, with the theatrical generosity of a man who had been waiting all evening for this moment, that he and Sasha had prepared a small gift, a formal signing of the Joint Asset Protection Agreement, witnessed by the family. As a symbol of their commitment to Daniel's financial security, he produced the document from a leather portfolio and slid it across the table toward me with a gold pen, explaining that as Daniel's next of kin, I was invited to co-sign as a witness. The room was watching. I picked up the pen. I turned it slowly in my fingers, the way I used to turn evidence samples in the lab before I cataloged them. I looked at Douglas. I looked at Sasha. I looked at my son's face open, trusting, the face of a man who had spent 4 years rebuilding his life after losing his mother, who had finally found something that felt like happiness. I set the pen down. I stood up. I told the room that I had spent 38 years of my life investigating fraud, and that the single most important lesson my career taught me was this: a lie does not become truth because it is dressed well and served at a nice dinner. The room went very quiet. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed 3 folded documents. I set them on the table in front of Douglas, one at a time, face up. The first was a copy of the Nevada conviction record for Douglas Farr. The second was the Clark County marriage certificate. The third was the toxicology report from the lab, with a photograph of the pill bottle and a 1-page summary of the chemical findings printed clearly at the top. I told the room, calmly and without raising my voice, that the man seated at this table was not Colin Merritt. He was a convicted felon named Douglas Farr. I told them that Sasha was not his sister but his wife, that the document they had just tried to have me witness was a financial instrument designed to strip my son of every asset he owned, and that the pills I had found in their rental house were a pharmaceutical cocktail capable of inducing a fatal cardiac event in a healthy adult male. Douglas stood up so fast his chair went over backward. He grabbed the documents off the table and threw them to the floor, pointing at me and telling the room I was a paranoid old man who had been trying to destroy this relationship since the beginning. His voice was loud and completely steady, which told me he had prepared for this possibility. He was still preparing his second sentence when the doors of the private dining room opened and 4 federal agents walked in. Dennis Carver showed his credentials to the room, identified Douglas by his legal name, and instructed both him and Sasha to remain seated. Douglas did not remain seated. He moved toward the service exit at the back of the room with the quick, purposeful stride of a man who had left rooms this way before. He made it 4 steps. I had asked Dennis for one specific accommodation when we planned the operation. I was the one who had spent 38 years on this case, even if this case had only existed for 5 days. I wanted to be the one standing at that back door. I am 64 years old with a bad left knee, and I was standing at that door when Douglas came through it. I did not use the walking stick as a weapon. I used it as a bar. I planted it across the door frame at hip height and let his own momentum do the physics. He went down hard on the service corridor floor, and by the time he got his hands under him to push himself up, 2 federal agents were already behind me. They arrested them both in the corridor, away from the dining room. I heard Sasha's voice once as the cuffs went on, not frightened, not pleading, just clipped and practical, already asking for her attorney. Even then, I thought, she was composed. Even then, she was calculating her next move. I walked back into the dining room. Daniel was standing at the head of the table. He had read all 3 documents while I was in the corridor. His face was a geography I did not have words for, not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something more total than either of those things. He looked like a man standing in the foundation of a building that had just been demolished around him. I walked to him and put my arms around him. He held on for a long time, and I let him, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate to that moment. I just held my son in the middle of that wrecked, silent room, and let him feel the one thing that had been true through all of it, that I was there, and I had not stopped, and I was not going to stop. The trial moved efficiently. The federal case was constructed on 3 pillars: Douglas Farr's false identity and prior conviction, the asset protection document signed under that false identity in a related financial communication the FBI had intercepted, and the toxicology evidence paired with the digital purchase records for the pharmaceutical compounds traced to an online pharmacy account registered to a shell entity connected to their LLC network. The North Carolina case was reopened, and the original accidental drowning ruling was vacated. Both Douglas and Sasha accepted plea agreements. Both are serving federal sentences. Neither will be out in any time frame that concerns me. Daniel took 4 months away from teaching. He stayed in Savannah at the house Carol and I had owned together, and we spent those months doing very ordinary things: cooking, watching baseball, driving down to Tybee Island on Sunday afternoons to walk along the waterline. He did not talk about Sasha much, and I did not push him. Healing does not move on a schedule that other people set. He went back to teaching in the fall. His students gave him a standing ovation on his first day back, which he told me about over the phone while laughing in a way that sounded almost exactly like his mother. There is one person I will mention before I finish. Frank DeLuca, who has pressed my shirts for 32 years, will never pay for a dry cleaning service in this city again for as long as I am alive to prevent it. That is a small thing. It is not an adequate thing, but it is the thing I am able to do, and I do it. To anyone listening who is a parent to any mother or father or grandparent, or anyone who has ever loved a person younger and more vulnerable than themselves, I need you to hear this. The people who come to prey on those we love do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with visible damage or obvious warning signs. They arrive with warmth and patience, and a carefully constructed version of everything your child has ever wanted. They are designed to pass every test you know how to administer. Your job is not to have a perfect test. Your job is to keep watching, keep loving, and refuse to stop being present in your child's life even when they ask you to step back, because the moment a predator succeeds in convincing your child to push you away is the moment they have completed the most important part of their work. It is always better to be the difficult parent for a season than to be the grieving parent for a lifetime. If this story reminded you that a parent's love is not a feeling but a decision, a daily, sometimes costly, sometimes completely thankless decision, then hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I read every single one. Stay present for the people you love. I will see you in the next one. Stay close to the people who love you, even when life gets busy and the distance feels comfortable. Walter didn't save Daniel with money or connections. He saved him by refusing to walk away, by showing up one more time when every signal told him to stop. The people who love us most are often the ones standing quietly at the door we keep almost closing. Don't let them stand there too long. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you an engaging, heartfelt experience while leaving behind a lesson worth carrying with you.